Tonight, I am going to continue talking about the book Preparing to Die by Andrew Holecek, and where I am going to start with is a new section. This section is titled After Death, and there are three different parts in this by three different authors. Tonight, I'm going to talk about After Death Care by Karen Van Vuuren and Working with Grief by Kim Mooney. I will not get to the last part of this chapter titled Working with Grief from a Buddhist Perspective, and this is by Andrew Holecek. To begin with here on this Aftercare by Karen Van Vuuren, she begins her section, her little, you might say, article with an example of Karen C., who had a home funeral. She died at home with friends by her side, and she helped create an after-death care plan. So, first of all, what is a home funeral? It is defined this way. It has come to mean after-death care in which a family or community plays an integral role. It often involves a wake or a vigil, with people paying respect by sitting with the body. And the location could be at home or a spiritual center, and it could be a nursing facility. And an after-death care plan. This should be done before death, long before death, hopefully, and should clarify the funeral wishes of the person that has died. And she mentions that it should be done in the absence of crises. People don't make good decisions when they're in the middle of an emotional crisis, needless to say. Then it must remain provisional. This is an important part. They say the first casualty of war is the battle plan, even before someone gets killed. And I like this because my definition of a plan is well thought out fantasy. So it has to remain provisional, flexible, and so forth. And this will help people who have survived you, because people, again, at the time of death, they can suddenly lose their, shall we say, rational control of their mind and what they say and what they do. This also allows survivors to add their own personal touches. She uses the word ritualizing a transition. So you could say this is like personal rituals for the individuals that are taking part in this after-death care. And that unique ideas of friends or families can be very meaningful, and it helps them, quote, creatively deal with their grief. It's important to remember now that the author is not necessarily a Buddhist, and I'm fairly certain I didn't look this up on Google, but I'm fairly certain that she is not a Buddhist, but she has worked with Buddhist families. And home funerals used to be very, very common before the Civil War, when embalming came into practice. And why are they popular? Well, the first one is that they're cheaper than going to a funeral home. They also provide environmental consciousness. And there is a desire among a lot of people to do it yourself across a wide range of activities, to do it yourself rather than have someone else do it for you, someone else perform the funeral. With a conventional funeral, then, the care of the dead is left to professionals, and that in the United States, conventional funerals are frequently nowadays talked about a celebration of life, which is almost like the opposite of a home funeral. A home funeral might talk about what they have done in their lives that is meaningful, but it also is looking forward to the transition from life to death, and in case of Buddhists, what's going to happen next. Whereas a celebration of life is concerned about what happened before they died. And I know this, that when a particular Tibetan teacher comes to the United States and they see the way they do funerals in the United States or celebrations of life, they're somewhat dumbfounded. Now, I have to say this, that my grandmother and her son, my uncle, ran a funeral home when I was growing up. My first job after graduating from high school, my first summer job, was working at my grandmother's funeral home for my uncle, because he had taken over the business by this time. And soon after that, my cousin took over the funeral home. And now I'm fairly certain that my cousin's son, and you figure it out, who is, what is the relation called? Is that a second cousin? Anyway, my cousin's son, I believe, is in charge of the funeral home now. And my cousin told me a few years ago that we're located in Madison, Wisconsin. And he said, we do 54% of the funeral business in the greater Madison area. And the competition has to split up the rest, 46%. That's an impressive statistic. And I want to add the reason why they have that much business from what I saw when I worked there. And they also buried my mother and they buried my father, because there's a family plot at a local cemetery in Madison. My parents died in Cottage Grove, Minnesota, and we worked with a local funeral director there. The local funeral director was very good, but when I compare working with a local funeral director in their setting and you might say, family's funeral home, my family's funeral home was much more informative, and you had lots of different choices. Just in case you didn't know this, if you want to, you can get a Packers casket. You can get a Chicago Cubs casket. You can get about anything you want to, probably even the New York Yankees if you want to. They had very good displays with all these things on it, and they were willing to work with whatever it is you wanted. Now, there is a very important Galupa center south of Madison. It's called Deer Park. It was founded by one of the men that gave the Dalai Lama his final exams. And when he died and they needed to do a traditional Tibetan cremation, very similar to what they did for Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche at Karmen Ling, they contacted my cousin. And I didn't attend the cremation, but my cousin did, and he sent me pictures of the cremation. And for my cousin, it was like, well, this is my job. And I think he really found it very interesting to be part of the planning. Maybe this is the wrong word, the execution of the plan. This is the kind of funeral director you want if you go through a funeral home, is a funeral director that is willing to be flexible, is curious about what it is that you want, and so forth. He also told me that he was surprised at the number of cremations they do nowadays. So, going back here, the problem with this idea of a celebration of life is there's no room to grieve. There's no spiritual foundation. And that it leaves people in a way having to deal with things on their own, maybe years and years later down the road. A few years ago, I was contacted by a family in Eau Claire whose, probably at this time it was a sister. They said they needed to have a Buddhist. She was dying, but she was still alive. And well, turned out that I was the one that got this person interested in Buddhism. She had moved to Arizona, I think, and came back to Eau Claire to her family. But way back before I did 3-year retreat, I got involved with the Vajradhatu group, and I had known this woman through the Sierra Club, which I was a member of in Eau Claire. And we got to be talking, and eventually I think she went to some of the Shambhala programs with me up in the Twin Cities. Now she is dying. So I worked with her. I wasn't present when she died, but then there was, of course, a celebration of life, and I did a short, brief Buddhist service for her. We were the only 2 Buddhists in the room. I found it very interesting. So if you haven't attended a celebration of life, this is what this business did. And their sign on the street, the biggest word on the sign was life. It wasn't a funeral home. It was life. And the room where I conducted this Buddhist funeral, everyone sat at a table. The tables were round. If it was a full table, a significant number of people had their backs to the front. And then other end of the room was a buffet set up. And after we finished, they brought out the food. You go up and get something to eat, and you bring it back to the table. And you have a meal with everybody. So it's very comfortable. So that's a bit what a celebration of life would be. People would come up in front and speak of experiences that they had with the person that had died, share these. There was a wall that was covered with pictures of what this person did during her life, and so forth. But again, there was no spiritual background that would help bring healing. So at the time of death and right after that, there's a dramatic change in circumstances for the person that has died and the family close to them. And these in-home wakes, vigils, and so forth give an opportunity to work with these things to help with this transition. Again, in this beginning part of this article, she talks about a woman whose baby was born without kidneys. They knew this through ultrasound before she was born. And so they planned for a home funeral. And that story ends with this quote: "She was so grateful to have had this healing time." The vigil of giving birth and then watching the baby die, and then having a home funeral for the baby. The next section is titled "Caring for Our Own Dead. Is it legal?" And that's a very good question, and partially because so little is known about this, because, well, now this was written in 2008, and a huge amount of change has occurred since then. But she begins with this quote: "In most US states, families may care for their own dead." So lack of knowledge, legal knowledge, and how to care for the dead are barriers. Funeral directors can help with these things. They can help with handling the paperwork, transportation of the body. When I worked at the funeral home, one of my jobs was to go to hospital morgues with a second person, and we would take bodies from the morgue to the funeral home. And of course, they could take the body from a hospital morgue to your home. Or hopefully, if it was a slow death, it could be hospice care and the person could die at home. Or in my parents' case, they died at this retirement community that provided 3 levels of care: independent living, assisted living, and a memory care unit. Some factors that get in the way of having a home funeral and so forth, besides not knowing about the legal factors, is that families may lack the resources that allow them to care for the dead. They may feel overwhelmed, and that the circumstances may be very challenging. There can be a hybrid situation where you have some help from a funeral director and the family and friends do some things too, a mixture. So now she gives a good source of information here. It's a book called Caring for the Dead by Lisa Carlson. And she is affiliated with this Funeral Consumers Alliance. And it has a website, which is in the book. So this has all kinds of information on state laws, procedures, pre-planning. Now, the next thing that she brings up in this article is, what about the money that it's going to cost? Where do you come up with that? She says that prepaying is not a good idea in many cases. And again, this Funeral Consumers Alliance has information on the benefits and the dangers of prepayment. quote, "It is important to carefully scrutinize the fine print of any pre-need document," end quote. About insurance. Insurance does not grow as quickly as money in the bank, where you have it invested in some kind of money market or a savings certificate. Needless to say, an insurance company wants to take a cut. That's how they make money. Then finally, she mentions totem trusts or pay on death accounts. And these would be individual trusts or savings plans that would be earmarked to cover funeral costs. And I was thinking about this, and in the case of a good Tibetan Buddhist, part of the funeral cost would be to send money to monasteries to say prayers for you. Could be KTD, it could be a monastery over in India or Nepal. I know a man that's in hospice care, and he has sent money over to a monastery in Nepal, and they're going to read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, of course, in Tibetan for 49 days for him. So you could go to a bank, you could go to an organization. There are a lot of investment companies out there like Vanguard. You could do some research on the internet, but they would have money market certificates and other kinds of accounts that are not risky, low risk. There's an interest, and you could just then earmark them in your will that this is where I want this money to go, and this is how I want it spent. So the next section is first steps following an expected death. This is talking about deaths that are slow, as opposed to a sudden accidental death of heart attack and so forth. And so here there is a time of transition from being healthy to dying. And this is a good time to honor this transition. Hospice care is very, very important. Talked about this already. And that hospice followed by a home funeral represents a continuum of care. It's not, well, you have this, and then you have that, and then there's a gap. There's a continuum. Now, after death, the author talks about her being present, and at the time of death, all kinds of cell phones are brought out and people start calling. There are only a few people that need to be notified of this death, and you can use a phone tree where a group of people are designated to call people. Now, when my best friend was killed in an accident in Menominee, he was run over by a county road grader that had just been fitted for its snow removal. And the police came to her door and said, "Your husband has been killed. I will stay with you until somebody comes here to be with you. So please call somebody." She called me. So I arrived there at the beginning of total chaos. I started calling people, and of course, they wanted to talk to the widow, which maybe was the worst thing that could be done. And I did not know a whole lot about this situation. If I would go through it over again now, I would say she needs time. Talk to me, talk to somebody else, give her some time. But everybody wanted to talk to her, and it was very difficult for me to get people to talk to somebody else. So this is important, is to remain calm and try to keep, you might say, keep the room calm, keep the situation calm. Try to cultivate an atmosphere of serenity. And it will be difficult. And something else that I noticed was as people showed up, as they were called, they wanted to come over. As they showed up, then again, that brought more chaos because some people were very adamant about this is what should be done. Again, the poor widow was present with all of this, and they would be talking to her or all of us. But when someone close to you has died suddenly like that, there's a period of numbness. It might last a long time. And this is important to know. I'm kind of getting ahead here, but this is what my personal experience was. Now, getting back to the book here, it's important not to disturb the body following death. And in Tibetan Buddhism, traditionally, it's 3 days. But in some cases, you can do that before that. If the person is under hospice care and they die, you don't even have to call the hospice right away. You can wait a few hours for that. It's good to note the time of death because the coroner will need to know this for the death certificate. But the coroner does not have to be here right after death. The coroner is the one who signs the death certificate and legally or officially pronounces them dead. So now comes the care of the body after death. And I'm going to go briefly through these things because otherwise it will take forever. It will be another 3 months before I get to the end of the book. So the first issue is rigor mortis, and this is the stiffening of the body after death. Needless to say, it's not a significant problem for bathing and dressing. Dressing in clothes, if you want the person to be dressed in clothes and other people to see. The next section is don't do it alone. So use the guidance of a spiritual teacher, an appropriate spiritual teacher when someone dies. And the general guidelines are for families attending their own dead is to remain fully present. But whatever works for you in terms of what you're doing, in a way, keep it so that you might say, death is normal, and so keep this process feeling normal, comfortable. When others are emotionally up and down, very stressed and so forth, if you can stay centered, if you can be a point of stability for others, that's very good. I have said this before, that you want to be the goat in the room because goats are paired with high-strung thoroughbred racehorses to keep the racehorses calm. So you want to be a point of stability in a room full of people that are very excitable. You want to provide a stable point of reference. So next, a sacred space. So here is a quote. If we view death as a spiritual transition, then we will have created the most beautiful and sacred attitude, and a beautiful and sacred space can then manifest around the dying person. So she recommends decorating the bedroom in an inspirational way. For Buddhism, you might have pictures of deities, the person's teacher, You could have statues, could burn some Tibetan incense, do it in a way to inspire people. Of course, remove all the medical equipment. So then there is a suggested checklist of items for physical care of the body. And the list looks pretty good to me, but you may want to adjust to your own situation. I'm not going to go down the list. It's in the book. And of course, before you begin to bathe the body or wash the body, she says, settle yourself. In other words, just take a few breaths, do a little shamatha, even if, again, if it's taking just a few breaths, and say a prayer or two. And the hospice staff or other caregivers can remove various devices that are hooked up to the person that has died. After that, then begin the bathing. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail for the bathing, but look in the book when it comes to that. And follow the book. Now, I have a pacemaker, and crematoriums say no pacemaker, they can explode. They can take care of the removal of the pacemaker. You don't have to do that. They also say no shoes, but that's no big deal. You can take off the person's shoes or never put them on. So next are temporary preservation methods. And embalming is not recommended. I never did any embalming, and I was never present in the embalming room of the funeral home when someone was embalmed. I will say this, that the funeral home tried to, you might say, preserve a certain decorum. When someone died, it was always Mr. Smith or Mrs. Jones. It was never, oh, the corpse. I will say this is just kind of has nothing to do with the book, but there was one man that worked there. His voice when he answered the phone was probably not the one you wanted answering the phone at the funeral home, because he answered it more like you might expect in a horror movie, answering the phone at a funeral home. And I'm not even going to try to imitate the way he sounded. Embalming is highly invasive. Basically what they do is they drain all the blood and drain fluids from many of the organs, and then pump the person full of embalming fluid that has a dye in it, and it is supposed to restore the natural color of the skin to a more normal tone. And a good compliment for a mortician is, Mrs. Jones looks better dead than she did when she was alive. And in many cases, this was the truth. It's amazing what they can do. And I remember my grandmother, while she was semi-retired, she would still go in and do makeup and hair for the women. This was a time of open caskets, and so the idea was make the dead look like they're sleeping. And this is, of course, temporary preservation. It's mentioned that, no, this is not what the Egyptians did. We're not trying to make them last for thousands of years. And when it comes right down to it, if you want that, you have to put them in a cave in the desert somewhere where there's essentially very, very little moisture in the air. As an aside here, I once had a book on preserving antiques, And this was by someone that worked for the Smithsonian Institute, the Smithsonian museums. And he said, your antique wants to be in a pharaoh's tomb. No moisture, no sun, stable temperature, da, 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 da. But this is not modern embalming. Here is a good quote. Dying of a non-communicable disease is no health hazard whatsoever. Death is not contagious. Some diseases are contagious. And then if they die of a communicable disease, you want to use gloves and other methods of sanitation so you do not catch the disease. Next is ways to preserve a body for a short period of time. The simplest is dry ice. And this can work for a few days. It's available at supermarkets or liquor store. I will have to say I've never seen it at a supermarket, and I don't go into liquor stores anymore. Anyway, you can always ask, just call up on the phone, and recommended 15 to 20 pounds per 100 pounds of body weight. And of course, dry ice is carbon dioxide, so you don't want to. Carbon dioxide does not smell, it's colorless, so you want to have plenty of ventilation where you're using it and where you're storing it. So it's good from time to time to check to see if the still is dry ice and to see how cold the body is and make adjustments. So there are other methods that are discussed here, and I'm not going to go into them. Caskets is the next section. You can get a casket from a funeral home. You can buy an inexpensive casket online. You can also make your own casket, or your family can make a casket if they know a little bit about woodworking. It doesn't have to be fancy. And crematories will provide a cardboard container that then will be burnt. So there's lots of things that can be done. Depends upon what you're going to do with the body. Burial, cremation, and where the burial is going to be, and so forth. Now, in terms of unexpected sudden death, could be an accident, heart attack, stroke. There may need to be an autopsy to determine the cause of death. And if you do not want to have the person cut up and investigate the various organs of the body, you could talk to the coroner. So there is a possibility of some flexibility. Of course, being reasonable, perhaps come to an agreement with a coroner. And you could request the coroner to close the incisions, quote, well. I have seen what the body looks like after an autopsy, and there are some very significant incisions. This is not precise like surgery. They're not worried about harming or hurting the body. So they do make some very deep and long incisions. So now if the body is in bad shape from an accident and so forth, it might be better to not have a home funeral. Or you could hire a mortician to repair the body so that it is suitable for viewing. There are body bags that you could get from a coroner. You can do prayers and practice for the deceased even in their absence. And then that section ends with, in my mind, whatever we do for the highest good and with the best intentions will serve to assist the deceased in their transition. So I am going to give another personal story about this friend of mine that died. As I said, he was run over by a road grader, a county road grader, you know, the kind with a belly blade between the front and the rear wheels. And it had a snowplow V blade in front for plowing snow. And the death was actually quite gruesome, but it ended up with him hitting that belly blade, and it rolled him around and then spit him out. And most of his body was beyond the rear wheels. Only his head was run over by the rear wheels. So there I was I would literally be there that first night till very, very, very late. Then I would take my wife and my son, I'm not sure what he was doing, come back, get a little sleep, and then go right back the next morning and be with his family. And his parents came. He had two brothers and a sister. They came. And the question came up about going to the crematorium and viewing his body. And for me, I said, I'd like to go. And so there was this discussion with family members and me about whether to go or not. And there was a lot of reluctance. In the end, the family members and I went to the crematorium. And he was in you might say, a cooler, a shelf on rollers where the body is. And they put him in, keep them cool. They pulled him out. Before we got there, put him on a table that had a drain on it and washed off the blood. And that was about all they did, and covered up his private parts. After that, then we went back to the house after viewing him. I was not Buddhist at the time. It's what turned me into a Buddhist eventually. But the point was, the family members that went there, even if they had a lot of misgivings about doing it afterwards, were very glad that they went, and that it gave them time to say good. One of his brothers, well, he was an avid deer hunter. One of his brothers was an avid deer hunter, and he brought a deer skin and put it on top of his brother. And it might have been burnt when he was cremated too. And, just these little personal things. So then what to do about odors and changes at the time of death when you're having a home funeral, and suggested burning incense, having a lot of flowers to mask the odor, and various other things. A closed casket can be a solution to that. And there are other things that are suggested. Then cremation or burial. And he talked about conventional cemeteries, and ask what is possible. That's always a good question. Investigate, because it depends on the cemetery. Some will have areas that you don't have to have a casket. It could be just person would be laid in a hole and then buried. And there are different types of vaults. And again, remember that even though they have these burial vaults and then a casket is put in them, this doesn't preserve the body forever. The person is dead, body will decay and degenerate. So some cemeteries have green burial sections. I've never been into a green burial section of a cemetery, but the author says that they tend to be more natural in their settings. They'll be in the biodegradable casket or without any casket. There may be simple markers allowed, or it might be just that you have location using a GPS system. So then they have the Green Burial Council listed as a good source of information about this. So home burials on your own land, check with ordinances. This can be healing with participation. The author mentions men might find it very healing to be digging the grave. Men like to keep busy, like to do things. If you have enough men around and suggest this, I'll bet you have no trouble finding enough to dig a hole. So then cremation or conventional, in a conventional crematory, and this is becoming very, very popular. It's cheaper and convenient. And many of these crematoriums are owned by funeral chains. Some of them are independent. And families have the right to witness a cremation. I have done this. It was a Buddhist cremation. And of course, being Tibetan Buddhist, there was a ton of chanting to be done. And I really tested the patience of the workers that were performing cremation. I finally ended earlier than I had intended. Next time I do it, I will shorten the prayers. You have the right to watch a cremation. There isn't a whole lot to watch once the body is put into the chamber. And it's probably a gas, natural gas, that is used for the fire. You can scatter the ashes as long as you follow the rules, bury the ashes. Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche recommended having the ashes at the columbarium site. And I have already reserved mine and paid for it in advance. And if you're wondering, just go to the KTV website. And then from there, there's a link to Karma Ling. And when you get to Karma Ling, there will be a mention of the columbarium. The container that the remains are held in, you will get a plastic box, the book says, as a temporary container. There are formal ones. You can have handmade ones made out of wood. If you know a potter, you can have one made out of pottery. I'm sure you can find on the internet just about anything you can imagine. And the author mentions that a family can use a coffee can. In other words, no big deal. And you can use eco or biodegradable. I'm having a hard time getting that out. You know what I'm talking about. Burial urns made from natural material. The author says we need to be aware of how our choices impact the planets. On the other hand, we need to do what we feel will honor their dead, our dead, in our own way. And again, as Buddhists, I'm going to get into this at a later talk, but there is this Bardo packet or Bardo box that has been prepared under the direction of Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche. There's a lot in it, and I highly recommend getting one of these and studying it, and then using it when a Buddhist that you know die, or instruct others on how to use it when you die. And open air cremation. This would be what they did for Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche, but this is done in the Tibetan tradition only for people that are very important. In Tibet, there would be sky burial. And I went to a sky burial site outside of Lhasa one time. And I found it interesting that there was nobody at that time when I was there that was being buried, so to speak. But there was a cliff with vultures on it waiting. And there was also a very huge flat rock, I mean, very huge, that had ashes on it. And I asked the monk that was in charge of this site, well, why do you burn people? Are they all sky burial? And he said this, which surprised me. And I've never asked anybody about this, but he said, some people, their karma is so bad that the vultures won't eat them, so we have to cremate them. That's what he said. If you want to talk to some Tibetan teacher about this, I have yet to do that. That would be embarrassing to the family, I think, the survivors. Anyway, he talks about how with a cremation, you takes a lot of firewood, can take, quote, the best part of a day for the remains to actually burn to ashes. Again, check with the local laws and so forth. And of course, you have to have the cooperation and consent of the local fire department. On the other hand, and I find this interesting, quote, open air cremations are certainly an incredible, inspirational spectacle. I don't think she is a Buddhist because I wouldn't really call them a spectacle, but they are inspirational. She talks about working with a family who had an open air cremation on their farmland. They had to get a permit, and it wasn't a problem. During the last week of the woman's death, the husband began assembling the funeral pyre, clearing the land of nearby trees and combustible material, had a base of cinder blocks, and then laid a metal grate and then put a mountain of firewood. And the end of the story is that it was meaningful. What to do with the cremains? There are many options, and she mentioned some are not legal, but they're done anyway. One that was mentioned was scattering them on the person's favorite golf course or even their favorite hole. Rinpoche felt that all of these things were not very good for the dead, that put them in the columbarium where prayers are done regularly, morning and in the evening. She mentions cryogenics, freezing the body. Hopefully in the future, then they can be revived and brought back to life. I think this is, well, it's science fiction. I don't recommend it. Then there's a new one here that I had never heard of before, and that is using liquid nitrogen to turn a human body into compost. And at the end of this section, quote, surfing the internet will turn up many more, sometimes unusual ways to deal with our bodies. Then she talks about donating the body for research. When they are done using the body for research, then the family will get the remains. And then organ and tissue donors, again, once the harvesting procedure is complete, the families can conduct their own ceremonies in any way that they wish. Exposing children to death. It's good to expose kids to death. Interesting, in farms, animals die frequently. And farm kids are used to animals dying. And with more and more pets in people's houses, I think more and more kids have experienced the death of a pet. maybe more than one death of a pet. This is good. It can help the children learn more about life and death, and can create wisdom, can create healing, and so forth. It's good for a child to be able to visit a parent that is dying or a grandparent that is dying and see them and say goodbye. So there are many stories here about how it has been beneficial for children. Again, with my own situation, when I visited grandmother, she was my grandfather had died long before I was even born, and so she, to me, was always a working single woman. And when I visited, she frequently was at work, and I would see her in the funeral home. And it was common to have a casket with a body in it at the funeral home. So it's important for us to pass positive attitudes on to children rather than fear of death. And here is a final quote. I believe that children and adults who have a spiritual framework for understanding the nature and meaning of death are able to integrate it in a healthier way. Again, hospice care is highly recommended, and caring for the dead is our final gift to our loved ones and to ourselves.